We have a story that is just a marvelous story. Brian Wills was a young tennis pro who worked hard to stay in top shape. You can imagine his horror when doctors found a tumor three times the size of a tennis ball. They told him this rare form of cancer was incurable and in its final stages. But when others would have given up, Brian turned to prayer. And here's that incredible story.
I just had always been confident, you know, in being strong and being physically fit. And I never thought something like that would ever, those words would ever be said over me. I never thought a doctor would come to me and say I had an incurable disease.
Incurable disease? That's impossible. Not Brian Wills, the 22-year-old tennis pro. Athletes like Brian who train 6 to 8 hours a day aren't supposed to get incurable diseases. Or are they? When Brian Wills first began complaining of abdominal pains, doctors told him it was just muscle fatigue. But the pain persisted until finally one night, Brian awoke with a raging fever. At this point, he knew it had to be something more serious than sore muscles. So Brian went back to the doctor the next morning to find out exactly what was wrong.
He first thought that I had either appendicitis or a kidney stone.
By that time, Brian's white blood count was at 20,000, and his right kidney was completely blocked. Admitted to a local hospital, Brian then underwent an extensive battery of diagnostic tests. 9 days later, after a thorough examination, doctors were able to diagnose Brian with a rare form of cancer called Burkitt's lymphoma.
All of us, the doctors who treated him, were very fearful that the tumor may advance rapidly, and that would be the end of it, that the patient was really unsalvageable.
After Brian was diagnosed with Burkitt's lymphoma, he was then transferred to the National Institute of Health in Bethesda, Maryland, where he would undergo a 7-month intensive chemotherapy treatment. By the time he was admitted, Brian's tumor had grown from the size of a golf ball to 9 inches in diameter.
It felt like I was pregnant.
So you could actually see your stomach was distended.
I could go like this, and this tumor would just slosh back and forth.
He's stage 4. He had clearly very advanced disease. We do not see cases of Burkitt's any more advanced than he has, because if they get more advanced, they come in a coffin.
Brian was admitted to the NIH in critical condition with a tumor that was literally growing by the hour.
There is no way that Brian Wills was going to be living 1 week from before we started therapy. He was going to be dead in a week if we didn't start therapy.
But because Brian's right kidney had shut down, starting treatment at that point would have been risky.
And it was at that time that I felt like the Lord just spoke on the inside of me. He said, you know, son, you know, don't be afraid. You know, if you'll put your trust in me, I'll heal you, and you'll walk through the fire but not be burned.
The day after that foxhole prayer, as he likes to call it, Brian's kidneys amazingly began functioning again, and he was able to begin treatments. It was then, following the first dose of chemotherapy, something incredible happened. Radiologists performed a CAT scan, and miraculously, Brian's x-ray showed no evidence of the tumor. To Brian, it was a sign that God was answering his prayers. Brian's doctors, however, didn't share his optimism.
He said, I wouldn't get your hopes built up too much, because you have to realize this is a very incurable disease, and it's very fast growing, and it may look like it's, you know, it may look like it's gone now, but it'll always come back. You know, this thing just doesn't go away.
Maybe so, but for Brian, that CAT scan was even more proof of God's faithfulness, and it gave him the hope he needed to keep trusting the Lord with his chemotherapy, the hope to praise him even despite the deadly infections attacking Brian's weakened immune system.
It seemed like it was just one fight after another, and God was showing me that it was a step-by-step process, that he was healing me actually from the inside out.
After 7 months, that process was completed, and Brian was released from the hospital to begin his recovery.
They had told me that if I went 3 months, that the likelihood of this disease, since it had been so fast growing, the likelihood of it coming back was, you know, was very small. And then at my 3-month checkup, they said, well, if you go 3 more months, you know, after 6 months of being off chemotherapy, if it doesn't come back, it will never come back.
It never did come back, but Brian did. Told he would never play tennis again, Brian Wills would later go on to realize his lifelong dream to compete on the European pro tennis circuit, a dream come true because of a courageous faith in the power of prayer and a firm belief in the truth of God's Word.
Psalm 149, verse 5 and 6 says, "Let the saints be joyful in glory, let them sing aloud upon their beds. Let the high praises of God be in their mouth and a two-edged sword in their hand."
What was the end result? I mean, here 4 years later.
Well, we're very gratified. Brian is a very fortunate young man.
As a matter of fact, in Brian's group, I think there were 7 folks with Burkitt's lymphoma. Brian is the only survivor in that group.
He should have died, but God said no.
Praise in his mouth and a sword in his hand.
Isn't that beautiful?
Wonderful.
I shall not die, but live and glorify the Lord. Ladies and gentlemen, we have been having prayer. This is a special week of prayer, and we have a telephone number where you can call in. We're asking this week for you to pledge something. Not money, but we ask you to pledge prayer this week.